He's stroking the pin, and he's so excited. He's like, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, like Gollum with the ring, he's just like, oh, precious.
Thank you. So, several years ago, I was in graduate school, and I was presenting a year-end project. It was a film that I was really excited to work on, and really excited to present to my colleagues. I was so proud of what I created, and I was sure that they were all going to love it. And so there I am in the audience. The film ends, the lights go up, and it's my turn to take questions and comments. And before the lights could even finish going up, before I could even get on stage to take people's questions, one of my classmates, his hand shoots up. And I'll never forget the first words out of his mouth. "I can't believe you made us sit through that." So this film that I thought was really pretty great, it was a bit of a failure. I created something that started, a bunch of things just happened, and then it ended. And I failed to engage my audience. Now, somehow that year, I had forgotten one of the foundational tenets of filmmaking, which is that if you want to engage your audience with a film, it's not about how gorgeous you shoot everything. It's not about how great of an idea you have or how wonderful the editing is. If you want to engage your audience, you have to have a story at your foundation. Now, software, websites, apps, services, whether they're digital or analog, I'll call these things all products for short, they have a lot in common with a film. If you want to engage your audience with a product, you have to have a story at your foundation. Now, you can lay the story down by accident, like I had, up until that point I had done with a lot of my most successful films. You can lay this story down by accident, like you're undoubtedly doing in your own product work, whether you realize it or not. Or you can lay this story down with meticulous care and intent, like I eventually learned to do with films, and now more so with products and services. You can lay this story down like this person here. This is Vince Gilligan. He is the creator of the TV show Breaking Bad. And what he knows is what all screenwriters know, what I eventually learned the hard way, which is that if you want to lay that story down at your foundation, you do it with cards on a wall. There's nothing fancy about here. You just go as low budget as possible. Sometimes you have many, many walls. What laying the story down helps screenwriters do is, so what he seated in front of is a story map for season 4 of Breaking Bad. And what it helps them do is essentially this. This is a close-up of a story card from around 3/4 of the way through, near the end of season 4 of Breaking Bad. And if you've seen Breaking Bad, you know what this card refers to. And if you haven't, some of you already know I love giving homework. So giving you all homework. You have to go home and start watching Breaking Bad. And so you will know what this refers to. What mapping the story does is help screenwriters make things go boom. Possibly on screen, if that is part of their strategy, and absolutely for people on the other end. Now, in order to understand how this works for not just movies or TV shows, but products, we first have to know how it works for movies. And so I'm going to use one of my favorite movies as an example to walk you through the mechanics of story structure. So Back to the Future, and I guess I always have to ask this question, but have any of you ever not seen Back to the Future? You can raise your hand if you haven't. I'm going to embarrass
you, but okay, one person. So my unscientific survey, I survey every group of people I ever work with just to see, and no matter how large the room is, it's always one or two people who haven't seen it. So almost all of you have seen it. For the one person in the back who I want to embarrass, that's your other piece of homework. So you have to go home, watch it. It's great, you'll love it, I promise. And for the rest of you, I'm going to recap how this works, the mechanics of it. So essentially, at the core of it, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And on this axis, we have a structure. We call this the narrative arc. And on that arc, we've got plot points. And let me show you how they all work. So essentially, at the beginning of Breaking Bad, this is the same thing. Once you start looking for story mechanics, you see it everywhere, and you realize, oh my God, every single thing uses this. But so in the beginning of Back to the Future, we're introduced to Marty. And he's got things that he wants, things that simple things like he has a girlfriend, he wants a truck, he wants to do cool things with his life, he wants to go places. His family, they're kind of not so cool. He wants to make something of himself, and it's great because he's got this friend Doc, and they have a time machine, and all is good in the world at the beginning of a story, so that things can go change, I'll say, so that a problem can arise, and we as viewers really identify with the problem. It hits home at this point. And so what happens in Back to the Future is Doc gets shot, and things are suddenly no good, and Marty has to figure out how to get out of the situation, and he jumps in the time machine, and next thing you know, he's back in time. And this leads to what we call the rising action. Now, the idea is that a story at the beginning has to start out as quickly as possible, and this inciting incident or problem, it kickstarts the hero on a journey. They often don't start off a story wanting to go on a journey, but something forces them to. And what we jump into is called rising action, because what that means is this y-axis here, you think of it as interestingness or intrigue. So things get really interesting, and then they calm down. Things get tense and more exciting, and they calm down throughout the story. It's not good or bad. And so the rising action here, things just get more and more interesting as time goes on. So what starts to happen, he meets his mom has a crush on him, things are just weirder and weirder. All along, he's focused on this fixing this problem. That is what all stories are based on. It's a hero who is trying to remedy some kind of problem that was introduced early on. He's trying to get back to the future. So things get more and more exciting, and he's getting close, and around 3/4 of the way through the movie, we feel like, oh, maybe he's figured out how to get back home, and something gets in the way. It's what we call the moment of crisis. This is the point of no return. This is the point where we wonder, will he or won't he make it? And so what happens in this story is he starts disappearing. His parents have never met, and or they haven't kissed yet, and so he won't have been born. And he can't play Johnny Be Good on the guitar, and things are just very, very, very bad. If the story ended here, it would be a tragedy. And luckily in our work, we're not in the business of building tragedies. So we are concerned with the happy path, the happy story that eventually happens, which is his parents eventually kiss. He will have been born, which is great. And they figure out how to power the time machine. And this leads to what we call the climax, or the resolution. It's the highest point in the arc. It's the most exciting point in the story, and it's sometimes called the resolution because it's where the problem that came up early on, it's when that problem is resolved. So they figure out how to get Marty back in time. There's some explosions and fireworks, and everything's very, very exciting. And then what? So at this point in the story, you always have to ask yourself, then what? Like, where does the story go? And so this leads to what we call the falling action, or the fancy French word is denouement, which means literally unknotting or unraveling of the story. And so what he happens here is he ends up back home, and home is better than when the story started. What we see is Biff is their manservant, and his parents are all cool now, and like all is good in the world. And that's how stories should come to a close. Usually the world of the story is better, and the hero is better than when they started, and they've learned something and accomplished something. And so we wrap this up and come to the end. He sees his girlfriend, they embrace. I've had the craziest day, and all is good in the world. Now, what then happens, though, if this was a traditional Hollywood movie, it would have just ended there. But Doc comes up and he says, Marty, come with me. And what we have here is a little taste of what will kickstart the action for what will be the next movie. And so this is how narratives go from being a one-off narrative to serial narratives that happen over time in different episodes. Now, so this is how story works for something like a movie. I want you to look at this photograph. So some of you were, a couple of you were in the workshop today, so you can't answer this. And if you've read my book, you can't answer this either. But for the rest of you, if I was to ask you, if I was to first tell you that these two people are using an Apple product, an app that comes pre-installed on every iPhone, what app are they using? You could just yell it out. FaceTime. So that took you split seconds to compute. Now, what is going on here? What scientists tell us is that when we look at a photograph, our brain jumps into narrative mode. They call this narrative parsing. We start looking for a story. So we see these two people, they're a little bit older. We think, well, maybe they're grandparents, maybe they want to see their grandkids. They're using an iPhone, it's in landscape, FaceTime comes installed on an iPhone. Maybe they're using FaceTime to talk to their grandkids, they're really happy, it might be as simple as that. That again took you split seconds to compute. It's such a subconscious effort that you're not even aware that you're computing stories all day long. Now, what scientists also tell us is that the same brain capacity you use to understand anything from a 2-hour-long movie to a 5-year-long TV show to looking at a photograph and parsing meaning in a series of split seconds, it's the same brain capacity you would be using if you were these two grandparents thinking about FaceTime as a product or actually using FaceTime over any period of time. What scientists tell us is that life is a story. And in that story, you are the hero. And this is what we do on a daily basis. We experience life, we live life, and we're constantly on a mission to feel heroic about anything we do. And so I want you to think of yourselves not as, I'm a developer, I'm a product manager, I'm a designer, I'm a this, that's all, I'm an entrepreneur, the list goes on and on. That's all great and important, but we are all in the business of building stories. We are all in the business of building heroes. These heroes are going to experience the stories in everything we put out in the world. So ideally, when we put things out in the world, we're thinking about what the best possible story is going to be. So ultimately, I'll talk a lot about the brain science behind this in a little bit. Ultimately, the effect of those stories is as impactful as they can be. So I want to start at the highest level, which is how does a story govern how we think about a product at a high conceptual level. So if you take the iPhone as an example, which I use as shorthand just because it's a product that we're all familiar with. Even if you don't own an iPhone, you own a smartphone that's modeled after an iPhone. So it's something that's familiar, but also because it's a product that has a story that could have been very, very different when it first came out about 10 years ago. So the story of what the iPhone could have been is about 10 years ago, you might have been someone who listened to music, and you might have been someone who made phone calls on the go. And this might have meant you had an iPod or a Discman, if you remember those. Like, it feels like so long ago at this point. And you had you might have had a mobile phone. Now, things were pretty good back then. Like, we were more mobile than ever, and life was awesome. So what was the problem? Well, it sucked to carry two devices. Wouldn't it have been nice to have a phone that played music, or an iPod, which people loved at the time, that made phone calls? And so what we wanted was Apple to build a device that a lot of people just called the iPhone, because we just did call it that. And so we wanted an iPod that made phone calls. That would have been a two-in-one device, a simple request. Now, when you actually dig down to the story mechanics of how this would work as a concept, what you start building into is sort of a pressure point that could be a crisis, which is, well, I might already own an iPod, I might already own a mobile phone, there might be usability questions, which is it difficult to use? Smartphones at the time were impossibly difficult to use, especially ones with touch screens. So, you're thinking, is this something that is worthwhile? Is it expensive? No one really wants to go spend more money on things. And so as you really assess the story, that falling action, the do I really want this, it is a big question mark. And you would think in terms of the end goal, which is like, how important is that promise of listening to music and making phone calls on the go from all-in-one device. Now, if you were to assess this story one way, what you've got is what we call anticlimactic, which is it's a problem and a solution, and it's a linear solution. A known problem, we want a two-in-one device, and the solution is let's build a two-in-one device. And what you see here is we're missing any kind of structure, and the structure is where that impact is. That's what clicks with the human brain, not just simple linear solutions. So if you were to assess this actually and build it out, what you could have is a prototype also that looked like this, because stories should be mapped, and they should absolutely be prototyped, just so you're 100% sure of what's going on. And so this is a schematic that Apple applied for it's in the U.S. Patent Archives. And what this would have been is an iPod that made phone calls. And if you remember the old iPods, how they had the click wheel, and it would work like this. And so the way this works is you would select numbers by going like that until you find the right one, and then keep going back until you find the right one, and just keep going. And this would have been not just more difficult to use than an iPod or a mobile phone, but this would have been more difficult to use than an old rotary phone, if you remember how those worked, right? Really easy. So what we have here, when you look at the story from a different angle, is this is what we call a cliffhanger, which is the story builds, oh, that's a really cool idea, a two-in-one device, and then if you were actually to have used it, you would have dropped off at the point of crisis as that question would have been answered, which is it difficult to use? And the answer would have been yes, extremely. So what was the story of what this device ended up actually becoming? Well, what we have is, if you take it up a few notches, and this is what all good stories do, you come down to the core of what people really need to do. It's not about, I want to make phone calls, I want to listen to music. You always dig down into what people really need to do, not just what they tell you they want. But so if you dig down to what people really need to do, they need to communicate. I'm someone, I need to communicate with the world around me. So great. Well, what's the problem? Well, the way Steve Jobs positioned it when he presented the iPhone to the world 10 years ago is the answer was, great, but the smartphones suck. Did you know that? And so if you think about it, what he was trying to say was, because smartphones were a tiny sliver of the market, most people did not buy smartphones then, no one cared about smartphones at all. And so what he's saying is, hey, there's a better way to communicate. So great. here, have an iPhone, it's a smartphone. So if you notice some tension building here, that's okay. Tension is how good stories are built. So what he's telling you is smartphones suck, but here's a smartphone for you, even though I know you don't want a smartphone. And so this story, by the way, it's the story of what the concept of the first iPhone ended up being, but it's also the story of the hour-and-a-half long presentation that Steve Jobs gave to present the iPhone to the world. So I'll show you in a little bit, but what stories of products at the conceptual level end up doing is they end up helping you build how the product eventually is going to work, and it also helps you understand how to talk about the product and also how to sell and market it and fully understand what it means to people on the other end. And so, all right, we've got a smartphone. Now, what could go wrong? Well, you might not want a smartphone. Again, no one wanted them back 10 years ago. It might be difficult to use. You might already own an iPod. You might already own a mobile phone. Like there are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want this device. Now, how did Apple overcome those potential pitfalls, and how did Apple solve this ultimate problem if there's a better way to communicate? Well, what they ended up presenting to the world was a device that they claimed was the best way to communicate. It was one that they claimed worked like magic, and it was one that was built not as a 2-in-1 device, but as a 3-in-1 device. It was a mobile phone, it was an iPod, and it did this third thing that they called an internet communicator, which is something that nobody asked for. You can access the internet from anywhere. Then, to which people were like, why? That's not anything that people wanted at the time. But what this ended up creating with enough of a structure that had an impact, that didn't just sell the iPhone as an idea, but then was one that people could eventually experience with the device in their hands over time, is it created a system where people might, right then and there, they might have ran to the Apple Store to buy a new iPhone, but that's not how this usually works. Most people don't do that. But over the last 10 years, most of us have eventually either bought an iPhone or bought a device that's modeled after an iPhone. Even a lot of your parents and grandparents eventually bought devices like this and might use it to FaceTime and do things that 10 years ago we never would have imagined. So to kind of reverse engineer this, the way this kind of story works, again, this is the conceptual model of how story governs how products work and why we get excited about them. We always ask at the beginning, who is our hero and what is their big goal? Then we ask, what is the problem? Why can't they otherwise meet their goal without using our product? Then there's a product name and some kind of market category. Then always know that there's some kind of competition that might get in the way of people adopting your product. It might be mental hurdles or mental reasons why people are resistant or don't want to change, because that's how humans are, right? We never want to, no one wakes up in the morning saying, I really want to download a new app. Like, that's my goal for the day, right? So, what are the reasons that could get in the way? And it could be actual competition. It could be real competitors in the marketplace that you need to consider how you are better or different. And that leads us how the climax here, how we overcome everything and solve the problem is your product has to offer some kind of value that people will eventually have to experience, and it offers some kind of competitive advantage. Then we have a takeaway, and you want to think about this in terms of, this is where you start bringing the business into the equation, which is you think about what do we as a business want people to think or feel if they were hearing about this product for the very first time. What would we want to go on in their head? It might be, oh, I would love to try that, or I'm curious, I would like to learn more, or I would like to buy that immediately, yesterday. Here's my money. It could be a ton of different business type of goals, but what's essential is that you start bringing the business into the equation and understand that we're mapping for not just what users need to do, but for what businesses need to do. And this brings us to the end of the story, where a goal is met, or the promise of a goal is met. So if it's the iPhone, the end of this story, it just takes place in someone's head as they're thinking about the iPhone as an idea. Again, this was 10 years ago. So I'm not going to communicate at the end of that story, but I can imagine myself using that phone or that device to communicate. And so this is when users' imagination comes into play. But again, it also has to tie into business goals. If Apple is not in the business of helping people communicate, then they've got a disconnect. So it's really important to make sure that you're aligning stories both ways, but also it's, again, a wonderful tool to get people aligned as you gain consensus internally on real projects and understand what are we working towards. Now, the story plays out so in someone's head in a series of split seconds as they think about a product. And it also then has to be the story that is experienced as you do anything from unboxing. So unboxing an iPhone has to feel that same story arc. You have to feel that magic at the right point. And it also then has to be the story that you experience in every key interaction with that product. So if it's a screen-based product, which it is, every time you do a key anything with that iPhone, you have to feel that narrative arc, and there is a structure to that I'll show you in a second, and you have to make sure that you feel like, yeah, it works. It works like magic. And so let me show you how that works with something as seemingly simple and kind of straightforward and boring as a user flow. And so what we have here is a user flow that Twitter came up with several years ago, and when they were having a problem with engagement. What they found was that people were signing up to use Twitter. They were getting really popular, but people were signing up and they weren't actually using Twitter. They maybe would use it once, and they definitely were not returning to use it over time. And so what they wanted to figure out was there a way to get people to experience the value of using Twitter in the first session with Twitter. And so they dug in a little bit, because what they ended up finding is that people who were more likely to engage with Twitter over time, in that first session, they all did one thing in common. They all followed at least 15 people. And so Twitter assumed, all right, there's something going on here with that. Why does it work, and can we duplicate it? And so they were able to duplicate it. What they ended up creating was a sign-up flow that works like a story, as I'll show you. And it was so successful, unfortunately, that they ended up having to keep that flow for years. And I think it drove people internally nuts. Like, they couldn't get rid of it because it ended up really, really working. Hundreds of millions of people signed up to use Twitter with this flow, and they were more likely to be engaged users over time. So they couldn't get rid of this flow again. But so the way it works is, at the beginning of the story, the exposition is you're on the home page. You've already come here, so you're curious about Twitter, and you want to know what this is all about. And so they spell it out for you. They tell you who you are. They say, welcome to Twitter, start a conversation, explore your interests, and be in the know. So, okay, I'm curious about this Twitter thing. Well, what's the problem? Well, so the way they position the problem, which is, it's simple, but it's, all right, if you want to be in the know, you have to sign up for Twitter. So the way they do that is with a button, a yellow button. We often call buttons call to action. And there's a reason for that. That comes from story vocabulary, that inciting incident, the beginning of the story. That's a call to action. That's when the hero is called on a journey to solve some kind of problem. And so in this case, it's simple. You want to be in the know? Well, you have to sign up for Twitter to be in the know. So great. I get started. So now we're in rising action, and just every step has to get more interesting than the last. So I'm introduced to the idea of a tweet, and then they teach me about how a timeline works. So if I follow people, then I get tweets, and I follow more people, and I get tweets, and then I follow more people, and I get tweets. And this happens for a series of steps. It keeps going and going to the point where you could be at a moment of crisis. You could, at this point, be thinking, I'm bored, why am I doing this again? What's the point? I'm not really sure, what I'm getting out of this. And so all you need to do is just click one more time to get to the next step, and you're at an unlikely climax. What we have here is essentially, at this point, a step where you're asked to give up your personal information, which sometimes can be a little scary, and you're invited to find your friends. What they're telling you at this point is that Twitter is not about just following celebrities and being in the know on what Beyonce had for lunch that day, but that Twitter is being in the know with everyone you know, colleagues, friends, contacts. And so that is the inherent definition of a social network, and that is, again, the high point. Unlikely, it looks like every other screen, but as long as you continue on to the next step, you've now experienced the value of using Twitter. Again, it's really simple. This point, the next step, it doesn't even need to exist. At this point, they're just asking you, hey, would you like to add your photo or add a bio? But you can skip it, and we just get to the next screen. We're done as soon as possible, and now we are home. And just like in a good adventure tale, home is better than when we started, and we are better than when we started. So technically we call this logged in home, and there's at the beginning of a flow, there's often a logged out version of home, and we have a rule of thumb, which is logged in home should always be populated with something. You never leave people on an empty state or on an empty screen with nothing there. And there's a reason for that, which is home should be better than when the story started. It should feel different, and we should feel like we've learned and grown and accomplished something. So this works on something that lasts a few minutes. It works on something that lasts even just a couple of seconds. This is a flow from an app called Fantastical, at which point you're just adding calendar events. So it just takes a few seconds. The climax of a flow like this, it's a little interaction with an animation at the climax that tells you you added a calendar event and it got added to the correct date. So a tiny little interaction, but again, it functions like a story, and that's when you feel that value in using an app like this. Stories can also be extended even farther and work cross-platform. So if you think about something like buying socks, there's a company called Happy Socks that makes socks that are really fun. They're fun and happy. They make you happy. That's what they're promising you, right? Buy our socks and you'll be happy. Your feet will be happy. And so you might get an email from them that says, "Hey, socks are on sale. Buy some socks." And you might be on your mobile phone and think, "Nah, I don't need socks. Maybe another time." And let's say maybe a week later, you're on your computer, you're on your desktop, and think, "Well, I don't know. Maybe let's go see what socks are on sale. Maybe I'll check out a pair of socks. I still don't need a pair of socks." And so then you go and you see a pair of socks that you like, and you think, okay, I like those socks. Maybe I'll buy a pair of socks, and then you add it to your cart. So that's one simple flow. And what we have here at the climax of that flow is simply an animation that lets you know that your socks were added to your cart. And so there's a technical reason why we would do something like that. That's what we call system feedback, which is that I performed an action and the computer tells me that I performed the action. So I see my socks being animated and added to the cart. But what you also see from a story perspective is that animation supports the Happy Socks story. It's a happy animation. It's fun. It's serendipitous. It involves things floating up and floating down. And so what we have again is a simple climax, but you feel good about having just put those socks in your cart, which is really important when you're buying something that you don't really need, a new pair of socks. And so again, one simple story with one flow that's on brand, essentially. And that's where it's really important to know, again, what the story of the overall product or the business is that you're mapping onto first, so that you make sure that everything you put in the story supports it. I always love using banking as an example, which is this animation, it's fun and serendipitous, and I typically say if you're working on a banking application, you might not have like a fun serendipitous animation because banking isn't it's not fun, but and there might be a different story that you need to support, like efficiency or something else. You might use animation, but it's a different story again, and you treat it differently. But I was a few months ago teaching a workshop in Iceland when I said banking is not fun, and someone in the workshop, she raises her hand and she's like, I work for a fun banking company, and it turns out in Iceland, I don't think you have this here, we don't have it in the States, but she works for a company that's reinventing how you save money, and they've become the fun banking company in Iceland. And so they're all about fun, so it's possible to have a banking app that's all about fun. But again, more than likely, the overarching story of whatever you're working on has a different kind of high point, and so you map your solutions of whatever you put into the interface across that story again, so that you're supporting it ultimately for your users. Now, the thing is, this can also expand past just what we typically consider an interface. So if we extend the story a little further and think about the next step that happens, if the beginning is I get an email and they want me to buy socks, and at the end could be I get a confirmation email that says that my my order was completed and that they're shipping and I'll get them in 2 weeks. So for the next 2 weeks, that's the end of my story. And if the climax comes nearest toward the end, then this is going to be my climactic moment with Happy Socks for the next 2 weeks. And so what we have here, it looks pretty boring. It looks like a really simple email, but it delivers and it continues that story. So what they have is copy that says, Happy Crew welcomes you to the world of Happy Socks. And then it has some other things. But simple piece of content and a nice exclamation point, again, furthers the story. And so this is where it's really important to start bringing in people from across your business to help you further and complete this story. So you might bring in marketing, or you might bring in someone who works on content. And it's great for them because they work on boring marketing emails all day long. So when you tell them that they're a part of building a story for your customers, they get really excited and appreciate you bringing them into the mix. So that's the high point of the story for the next 2 weeks until I get my socks. But it continues, right? So eventually I'm gonna get my socks. And luckily there's a genre on YouTube for unboxing Happy Socks. It's a genre on YouTube for everything. But unboxing Happy Socks. So this is someone who got their Happy Socks in the mail, and he's so excited, right? And so the high point for him at this point, first it's like the packaging. He's like, oh, look at this bag, and it's so, it's like so fun and whatever. And then he gets a little card when he opens up the package of socks. And he loves his card. It's like a thank you card. This person really loves this thank you card, and he's so excited, and he's like showing it to the camera. And so what we have here is a context with which we understand sometimes why we give gifts, right? We might give, like, people come to a party and you give them a gift, or in this case, I bought something and they gave me a little gift. It gives context. It's something at a high point. It's a nice gesture, and it also, in this case, furthers the brand. It's something about, happy people wearing socks and stuff. So a little gift goes a long way. But it also, it gets better. So this person on YouTube, his gift in his package was a little pin. And he's He's like so excited about his pin. He takes 10 minutes. Like the video is 10 minutes long, which is why I can't show you the whole video because it's just 10 minutes long. He's like opening it up. He's stroking the pin, and he's so excited. He's like, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, like Gollum with the ring, he's just like, oh, precious, and he's like, this is the coolest thing that's ever happened to him, right? So he's ecstatic. It's a little gift. So again, gives context to the overall experience and how they're providing you not just a product that they're selling, and they're not just building you a website to use, but it's an overall service and an overall story that they're building with you. But you can imagine what in this case would be, it's still a sock company. So what has to be ultimately the highest point of the story? Yeah, the socks. So if the socks don't deliver, then this is the most anticlimactic story ever. So what we have, eventually he finally pulls the socks out of the bag, and he starts similar like Gollum. He starts petting the socks, and oh my God, and he says they feel so nice, and he starts like looking at the stitching, and so ultimately the story has to deliver on the promise of the value that it proposed early on. And I'll say I don't work for Happy Socks, I swear, I promise, but I'm wearing a pair right now. They're like, it's hard to see. You can come up to me later, but they're like striped and pink and blue, and they're great socks. They're really, I've bought like fun socks before that wear out after a month or two, and it's really fun. I never buy them again, but they're really great. Really great socks. So what is going on here, if we reverse engineer this, is first, again, you always have to ask who is your hero and what is their goal. Then, next step in the journey, because we're getting more tactical here. This is just step 1, step 2, step 3 of an experience of any length or time. This journey could last years even. If you care about long-term engagement, it should. What's the problem or incentive or call to action that's going to kickstart someone on that journey? And this problem should echo the problem that you established early on when you were thinking about the conceptual story of your product. Then there's a flow. And all it means is just what's step 1, what's step 2, what's step 3, and so on and so forth. What matters again here is that every step has to be more valuable and more exciting than the step that preceded it. And this is why you prototype stories. So if you get it wrong, you just switch it around and redo it until you get it right. The story builds until you get to what could be an impediment. Now, the idea here is you just want to identify anything that could get in the way of the user solving their problem with your product and meeting their big goal. You don't want any impediments to happen, but you need to own the fact that they might happen, and you need to embrace the fact that they might happen and do everything you can to help users get over their that hurdle. And so impediments might be anything from sign up. You might require people to sign up for something. It might be payments. You require some kind of payment, or you need someone's credit card information. It could be funnel drop off that you see in your metrics or analytics, and you don't know why it's a cliffhanger and why things aren't ending well. It could be mental hurdles. Just people might be bored or lacking value, or just they might be encountering usability issues. Like they might just be stuck and not know how to get to the next step. So you get people over these hurdles, or you make sure that they don't happen in the first place, and then they're able to experience the value and solve their problem. So this is the highest point in this story. This is the highest point in the journey. Again, they solve their own problem, they feel empowered, they feel heroic, and they experience that value that your product proposed. So if it's Twitter, you're going to feel in the know. At this point in the story, you have to feel like you're in the know. If it's Happy Socks, your feet are going to be happy, then you have to feel at this point in the story that your feet feel happy, or they will ultimately feel happy. I feel happy. So then what? You always have to ask, then what? You need to bring people to closure. It's really important as humans, we need to feel closure, otherwise we feel really unsettled, especially if we've been taken on a journey that might feel a little tense or exciting at times. You need to bring us back down. And so all we have to do here is finish the flow, and we just got to wrap it up as quickly as possible. So if, maybe one more step and then you're done, but you don't want to drag things out here. And as soon as you can, come to the end of the story, at which point your user's goal is met. And I want you to also think in terms of the business's goal being met. The goal at the end of this type of story is 100% measurable. It's essential that you start thinking about how you're going to quantify goals for your users and for your business. So it could be your business maybe is focused on conversion rates for this flow. So, all right, we're going to measure and track conversion rates. Well, you might then as long as conversion is something that your users care about, then that's your metric. But if your user is focused on something a little different, you might have a slightly different metric for your users. And so whatever the metrics are, it's essentially essential that you smash them together and that you map them together, because a user meeting its goals without the business continuing its goals, there's a disconnect there. So again, it's really, really important. If you think of Twitter again, they measure the success of that story. And what they found was that, again, people were more likely to not just sign up for Twitter. What they found was with that flow, they got fewer signups than before. But what they got were higher quality signups. More people were signing up for Twitter and coming back after 3 months and using the service over time. And at that point, that's what mattered to the service, was getting more high quality people engaging with Twitter. It wasn't how do we make money. At the time, they weren't concerned with that. Now they are, and then good luck to them to figure that one out. They have to figure it out. At the time, it was engagement. That's how they were building their business. That's what mattered to the executives. That's what mattered to their board and anyone who was investing in their company. So again, goals are measurable. Now, the story can also play out, like it can be really long, it can last years again. The story can last 0 screens and have no steps. It could be something that's a conversation with a bot. So this is a screen from Slack where you're signing up for the first time. This is how they do their onboarding. Twitter did it with many screens. Slack is just one screen, and I'm just talking, bot is asking me questions. And that has a story arc. You could just look at it. It's on its side with the high point being, I'm all set up. Oh, cool. That was so, all I did was type in a few words. And that is when you experience the value of using Slack, that's the value that they propose, is it's easier than email. It's less of a hassle. You just type a few things and you're done. So the story can be really short. It can also last, again, years. It can last decades. It can last, I think that's all we can go in tech, or in our world at least. Decades is probably all we can ask for. I'm sure hundreds of years. There must be someone that's out there for hundreds of years, some businesses, but they can last indefinitely. Now, what matters here again is this idea of engagement, which is if you want to engage your users, you have to have a story at your foundation. Now, why story? This begs a question, because we could be here talking about, I could be telling you, hey, build gamification into everything you do, and you'll be more likely to engage your users. And there's something to that, not necessarily gamification, but if you built everything like a game designer builds a game, you would be more likely to engage your users. But what game designers know is what we're all starting to understand, which is that so game design essentially is built all on narrative architecture. They go back to the basics of story arcs, and that's how they build everything from a level or a part of a level in a game to the entire game. They all have arcs that last different lengths of time. So game designers have known this for a very long time, and it makes all of their work better and their games more engaging. They know it all comes down to the story at the highest level, conceptually, and the story of how people actually go through and play something. So again, why story? Well, so what scientists have, there's no definite answer necessarily, but what scientists propose is that story is something that goes back to the time of cave dwellers, and the idea is that back when we were hanging out in the caves and we didn't have a whole lot of language and we didn't have a lot going on, that it's hard to communicate. It's hard to communicate intent to people, and it's hard to understand people. And so the theory is that we've devolved as story-driven animals, because what story does is it helps us understand the world around us and to communicate with the world around us. The idea is that if, let's say we wanted to tell the kids not to go down to the river because they were afraid that they're going to fall in the river. So you could tell the little kids, don't go down to the river, you're going to fall into the river. And they're never going to listen to you, and the next day they're going to run down to the river and fall in the river. But if you tell them a story about Lucy, who last week Lucy ran down to the river, she was so excited and it's such a nice day, and then she, and she fell in, and then you tell, this tale of, and then the moral of the story is, don't run down to the river alone because you're going to fall into the river. And so that is what humans need in order to move to action, or in this case, inaction, and not run down to the river alone. So story, again, is one of the oldest ways that we have to communicate with the world around us. The idea here, so I want you to just think about this for a second, which is, why have we evolved story as a core mechanism of our brains? So there is no such thing as an actual experience. What scientists tell us is that there are moments in time, and time is fleeting. So that moment from a moment ago, it's already gone. And now I'm in a new moment, but this moment is already in the past. And so, but I'll try to catch up. Now I'm in this moment, but that's already gone too. If we actually had to experience that all day, every day, we would go crazy. We would lose our minds. We would not be able to make sense of anything. And so what our brains have evolved to do is to use a function to make sense of time, which is otherwise fleeting. Story helps us understand what just happened, and story helps us understand what to expect in the future, especially if we take some kind of action, and that's how stories move us to action. What story does is it gives structure to experience, and it is essential to us functioning as functioning humans. If we didn't have story, the ability to tell and understand stories, we would have a very serious problem on our hands. There's an actual disorder called dysnarrativia, which is the inability to experience narrative, and it's so debilitating. It's like having amnesia. Like, you can't function. You have to be, like hospitalized or have a home health aide with you at all times. Like, you cannot function in the world without story. What cognitive psychologists and neuroscience tell us is that when our brain consumes anything that's like a story, anything either that is told or anything that we experience that is structured like a story, our brains are activated. And we're more likely to see the utility in using something. So something is going to appear useful to us. we're more likely to see the usability in having used something. So the idea here is that there's a concept called the peak-end rule, which is we remember the highs of an experience, we remember the lows of an experience, and we remember what came nearest towards the end of an experience. And so if the high point comes nearest towards the end, that's what we remember. So if there are any usability quirks early on, as long as we kept going on the journey, I can't tell you how many times I've seen this in testing, in-person testing with users, where there are some usability quirks that the team thinks, oh my God, we can't launch with this, people are gonna hate us, they're gonna be very upset. But when you test it with people, what you find is that there's a usability quirk, but that high point is so high and people are so happy with the value that they just experienced that they forgive some usability quirks or bugs that happened early on. And what this helps you do is you can deprioritize certain things that you thought were so terrible that, oh my God, we can't launch this week with this bug, or people are going to hate us. But you can actually deprioritize it a little bit and say, all right, let's fix it in 2 weeks. But let's launch next week with this bug we know we have. But again, that climax is intact, and that's what people matter. People remember. And it's really important. Again, you should test this. You never do this as a leap of faith and say, who cares? It's step one, there's a big bug. I mean, if people can't move to the next step, that's a cliffhanger. That's different. So again, I'm talking small bugs and quirks. We're more likely to kind of forgive and forget them. When our brains consume things that have a story structure to them, we're more likely to see the desirability in doing something. Again, that's like we can see what to expect if we take some kind of an action. We're also more likely to not just experience the value in having done something, but remember experiencing the value. Again, that's just because that value is experienced nearest towards the end, and that's what we as humans remember. Our brains are not very, they're very sophisticated in some ways, but they're also not sophisticated in others. Like, we don't remember anything. But that last thing, oh yeah, that was awesome. And that's, that was cool, all right. So, and also lastly, we're more likely to want to choose to experience something again if we've experienced something that functions like a story. And so choice works in a couple of ways. One, I will be more likely to want to choose to experience something again, and it becomes easier for me to recommend things to other people, and when I recommend it, they're going to be more likely to choose to try that product or to go out and buy something. So stories, what you find is that they end up being amplified. They're not just ones that I, as one potential user or customer, will experience and ultimately be glad I experienced, but it's if it's good enough, it's one that I'm going to start recommending to others, and that story gets amplified and spread out to other people. And this happens for customers, and it also happens internally as we build stories with teams, whether you're working with an executive team, or you're managing a team, or you're working with engineers, product managers, designers, anyone across the company. And actually, if you can extend that even farther down to customer service, sales, marketing, it's essential that people understand that they all have a part in building a story collaboratively together with you and the rest of the business for the users and for the business. That is how people get excited about ideas. That is how you rally teams behind what you want to build. That is how people have a shared vision of internally how someone working at a company, how I feel like I will become a hero if I build this thing with my team, and I'll be successful. Because again, we all want to be heroes in our own lives, whether we're using a product or building a product. So the next time you work on anything, this is always what I want you to, if you take one thing away from today, this is what I always want you to ask yourself, which is, what's the story? Not, what kind of software are we using or process, or it has nothing to do with that. It comes down to, always knowing, essentially, or finding out, if you don't know it yet, what the story is. And that requires you to ask a few things, which is who is my hero, what is their goal, and how are we going to help them accomplish their goal. Also want you to ask, how are we going to make things go boom for anyone on the other end? And again, that could be users, it could be an internal audience. And also, how do we make things possibly last forever and ever and go on and and on and on and on indefinitely? If you'd like to learn more, my new book, The User's Journey, is it's out now. You can buy it on Amazon. You can also get information on my website, donnalichaw.com, where you can get just a link to buy the book that way. I also, on my website, have a bunch of downloads and tools and things that you can use on your next project. So I highly recommend getting the book, not just because I'm like selling the book, but I wrote it because I was giving talks like this, and people always ask, like, do you have a book I can read? And I didn't, except for Aristotle, which, you know, is very old and it's kind of not directly relevant to products. But so I wrote the book for you. I do hope you enjoy it. I will also be around now to hang out. And for some of you, I know I'll be teaching a workshop tomorrow on site with the Digital Product School cohort. And yeah, I'm also around if you ever want me to come work with your company. I can do that as well. I'm in Europe way too often, although these days I'm very happy to be here, as you can imagine. So anyway, thank you so much. And before we start, well, actually, I'm going to have a beer while we do this, but I would love to take some questions if you have any. And also, I will be floating around so we can ask questions that way. But if you do have a question, we have a microphone that we can pass around. I know, it's the end of a work day. It's hard, right? It's like work all day, then come here. But yeah, what questions do you have?
Everyone's scared.
Mm-hmm. Very scary. Oh, one question. All right, good.
Hi, thank you. Oh, hello. Okay, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My question would be, do you have an example, or can you tell us an example of a company that you helped building a story for their products?
So it's tough because I'm not allowed to talk about a lot of my work, but I do have one case study in the book that is an anonymized case study. So I kept it like anonymous so you couldn't tell who the client was. In the book there's a case study. I mean, that case study, it lasts throughout the entire book, so it's probably like 30 pages worth of case study. So I walk you through an example of a startup and how we went from coming up with the idea for a product. Well, we had the wrong idea for a product and couldn't figure out why, and so how we ultimately found the story and then built it into what eventually became a successful business. But worked on a lot of, trying to think, God, so many. Recently I worked with a publisher. They were trying to figure out what their story is today, in today where like people don't, like publishing itself is not necessarily a viable industry. Like publishers don't make a lot of money. Even me, like I'll tell you, I don't make any, but I can buy like beer with what I make from the book. Publishing, you do because you love it. But publishers, I don't earn a living through the book, so it doesn't matter for me. Publishers are really scared right now because they're like, oh my God, we're gonna die. We don't know what to do. And so this publisher wanted to figure out wants to figure out how to reinvent themselves as more of a learning company and not just a book company. And so they also have a lot of online courses and different online services that nobody knows about. So they want to figure out, how do we get people to know what we do, because they think we just make books, but we do all this other stuff. And so in that case, what we ended up doing, what I
end up doing, in most projects, is going out and finding customers who do engage a lot with the business or the product, and then finding out what the story is that they have with the company. And so with this one, it's I guess it's a little bit of currently a sad story, which is that they need to figure out what they are, because when you talk to people who love that publisher, all of them said, "Why do you love them?" "I love their books." You know, like I love their books. They're great. When was the last time you bought one of their books? Oh, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. So it's really important to better, you know, so for them what we ended up having was a brand awareness thing. And so we ended up bringing the marketing team in, because I'm not a marketing person or a brand person, and now they're working on a strategy to start letting people know, hey, did you know that we don't just do books? And this is what our story could be. Another example would be, worked recently with a nonprofit in the United States, which is, in the US, our public parks, are not necessarily managed by the city. So Central Park, for example, this project I can talk about. So Central Park, it's not run by the city of New York, because the city of New York doesn't have enough money, just typically American. And so what we do in America is citizens get together and they say, we want to mow the lawn on the park, we want to plant trees, and so they'll raise money and then start a foundation, and then that manages the park. Now this foundation needs to collect money from people, and so what I worked on with them is a digital strategy that helps them understand why people would give money to a park, and how that applies as a service. So what service does the park provide that people feel like they need to give money for? And how does that work in a digital ecosystem? So does it happen on the website? Does it happen on the mobile site? And ultimately, what kinds of products support that story? So what they found is that they don't need a mobile app, for example, but their website had to do certain things that it wasn't doing, and that it's now doing. So ultimately, more people could experience that story. So yeah, there are a whole host of, I know, there are a lot of projects that like I can't talk about, but any company that has an engagement-related challenge, that's usually where I come in. We want people to do this. We want users to do this. We want to launch a new product. We don't know if people want it. Yeah, it's a long answer to a simple question, but
thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
First of all, again, thanks very much for your talk. Very inspiring. I have one question. How do you see pictures? So, for example, like in my product management positions, we oftentimes talked a lot about pictures on landing pages, and we said, okay, the picture alone tells a story. Like, for example, happy people using your product. But when I now hear your basically story, I wonder if that's the climax already when you come to the page, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great question. So how do pictures fit into the story? And so it depends on where in the story people see those pictures. So if you take Happy Socks as an example, you might have noticed that email didn't have any pictures, and which at first surprised me, because I would expect a thank you email to have some kind of photographs or something in there. And so in that case, photographs were not necessary. All they needed to say was something really nice in that first line, and it made me feel good. But oftentimes, you will see in an email photographs, or maybe a landing page or a home page, you'll see photographs. And so if it's the, you can think of it one of two ways. If it's the beginning of a story, a photograph might serve as exposition. It might communicate to you, we know who you are, you're like these people here. And that's why it's really important to know who your customers are. And in that case, you might know what they look like, what demographics they are, how old or where they come from, and more specifically, what they do. So if it's sports related, you'll show people playing sports or, something like that. So photograph could serve, again, as exposition. It can also serve as orienting the user towards an end goal. And it might remind people, you came here because you want to do this, right? So you'll see people doing what you want your users to do. And that's really important. So if you think about a university website, for example, the cliche is, at least in the United States, this used to be more of a cliche. I think they're getting better at it. The cliche used to be that the homepage would show people sitting under a tree. And it was always like 5 people sitting under a tree, smiling. And it was just like, it's so silly, it doesn't matter. And so universities have gotten a little more sophisticated where now they show people doing something, like I'm in a lab, like making a test or doing something like that. So yeah, they show us who we are and what we could do. So I see it less as telling a story and more as being a piece in a story. You could think of imagery like photography or even content as, think of them like props in a movie. On a set, everything that you put in the scene is a term called mise en scène. We like French words, French terms in film. Mise en scène means to put in the scene. And what that means is that in the frame of any scene, every single thing that you see was put there by a human being who physically put it down. And so if it doesn't move the story forward, you don't put it in the scene. You cut it out or you don't put it in the first place. And interfaces are much the same. So everything down to photographs, copy, micro copy, it all has to move the story forward. So you just always want to ask, how is this moving the user's story forward? And if it is, then put it in. And if it's not, take it out.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
How would you... Okay. How would you argue to invest money into very nice packaging to have a very, very nice story? Because what if I would tell you, okay, it's very nice to have a nice packaging around the product that I get home, but it just costs me money. I'd rather focus on digital stuff and to get some more money, like with coupons from other people. But how would you argue, like, no, it's really, really necessary to invest this money to have this nice packaging around?
That's so it's a good story, which is how might you, in a business context, get people to agree with you that it's important to invest in packaging design when it seems like that's otherwise a waste of money. And so to use Apple as an example, the way they figured it out was, so Johnny Ive, the lead designer at Apple, what he's talked about is what he calls the theater of packaging. And so he goes on and on about how packaging is theater and it tells a story. So he loves that. And so my guess, because this is how I've seen story used most effectively in business context, is that my guess is that early on when he was having conversations with Steve Jobs about packaging, that he probably, to Steve Jobs, proposed the story of what unboxing could be like and how it could work like magic, and that sold it for someone like Steve Jobs, who was almost like a story sleuth. He would just see stories in things, whether he was consciously seeing them or not. And so that's my guess is that Johnny Ive was able to sell the idea of investing in packaging that way. Apple as a company, they're an excellent example of a business that I'll say was story-driven, because I'm not quite sure they've got it at the moment. Without Steve Jobs there, it'd be nice if I hope they can get this back again. But when Steve Jobs was there, they're a very story-driven company, and everyone there was trained in the art of how to sell ideas to Steve Jobs. So if you were ever meeting with him in a conference room and presenting something, so let's say I just came up with a prototype for a remote control and I'm showing it to him, my managers had to train me on how to pitch this to Steve Jobs. And what people there knew was that that is a story, and you're building it in certain ways with, everything I told you, like the setup and then citing incident, and they would poke holes in it. You had to know what all the potential problems were with your proposal before you presented it to Steve Jobs, because if you didn't catch all the potential challenges and bottle up that tension before you met with him, he would be a real jerk. And that was the problem. Again, I don't want you to think like I think Steve Jobs was the most amazing person on the planet. He was a real jerk. So don't make people cry. Don't make your coworkers cry. Don't send people home. But they really, really would focus on the story behind everything that they pitched internally. So in general, when trying to pitch things internally, if you can use this structure to make your proposal more effective, you will be more effective in everything you do. Whether that's you give a presentation with slides, or you just verbally present. Another thing in Apple executive meetings, no one was allowed to bring slides. So if I am pitching this, I had to just bring this, and I had to talk. I had to walk people through it. So sometimes you can use slides, other times you don't. But yeah, everything's a story, and it's how you convey and convince people to do things. But again, you always have to still tie that story back to the business value. If you're not convincing people the value of it, then you're not able to. So in this case, there was brand value, which is, we're conveying the magic, the gravity of our products, and on and on and on. All right. Any other? I see no more hands. One more.
Just interested if you can describe some methods of verifying that really the story worth is it good enough? For example, is that point high enough? And because people creating the product usually are bounded by their subjective views on the product and all this stuff, and it's hard to see how the others will see the same thing.
Yep, that's a great question. So, how do you know the story is good enough? And the trick is to test and validate the story as early on as you can. And so, and you can do that at different fidelities. I'll give you one example. So, a client, I won't name them. But they produce computer peripherals like keyboards and presenter remotes and things like that. And probably many of you own their products. And so what they were trying to do is come up with this new idea for a keyboard. And they thought it was the best idea ever, and they thought it was really cool, and they had the story all mapped out, and it looked good to them. It was like the story, the keyboard that was going to help you have a better relationship with your mobile phone. I'm not presenting it the right way, but they thought it was a really great idea, and so they put it out. And they as quickly as they could. So once they were done with the drawing board, they went out to customers and they started testing the idea. And in this case, the way they tested it was through conversations, talking to people. So what they wanted to do is validate that they knew what the problems you have are and what your goals were, and they had lightweight sketches, just like visual sketches, conversations, sketches, and nothing too serious. They didn't want to spend a lot of time and money validating the problem until they knew it was the right one. And so when they went out and talked to customers, they found that it was the completely wrong story. Like, no one wanted to be more connected to their mobile phone when they were at their desktop. Like, it was just like this. They kind of had it a little bit wrong. But what this ended up doing for the business is, like, they saved, God, I don't even know how, like, millions of dollars by not building this product. Whereas in the past, what they would do is they had a good idea, people got excited, they got funding, and then they go build it, and then they put it to market and realize, oh crap, like no one wants it. And so what the story in this helped them do was it helped them see specifically where the story broke. Like, our goal was wrong and the problem was wrong. And that's a big deal. And so again, it's really it's important to test early, but what story does is gives you a framework with which to assess and test so that you're like, oh, wrong and right. Other ways to test, and I go into detail in the book about this, you can test prototypes early on, so you can make paper prototypes or make them digital prototypes. You can test through having conversations with customers and seeing how the conversation goes and what the plot points are there. Ideally, stories are also data-driven in the first place, where you come up with the story because you already have gone out and talked to customers and they've told you the story. And if they've told you the story enough times, you can reverse engineer that and you know exactly what the story is. And so, like for Central Park, for example, we went out and when we talked to people about why do you donate money to Central Park, they would tell us things like, I feel like it's my duty. I give money because I feel like I'm a real New Yorker if I give my money to Central Park every year. So, we talked to other people, and what they told us was, well, I use Central Park every day because I run there and I picnic there. And if I give money so that the benches can be clean and the sidewalk can be, fixed when it's broken and the grass can be mowed, and I have to give money. And so those end up being stories that you can replicate once you have data to back it up, that these are our user types. Then you build the entire experience around that. So when you go to the website, you see things like with them, one theme that kept coming up was daffodils. People were like, I give money because I love those daffodils, right? And when I came back to the client and I told them I heard daffodils over and over again, they were like, oh my God, the daffodils. Apparently, a lot of their money comes from people who love daffodils. And they have the data to back this up again. And then suddenly here I am telling them, I have a story about daffodils. I don't understand what this means. So now, part of their strategy, it sounds so silly, but talk about photography and imagery, they're putting more daffodils on their website. It's kind of insane. But so at their best, again, stories are data-driven. We already have data to back it up. And at their even better best, they're the stories that we test out with real people at different fidelities, at different stages of a project, so that we ultimately know, yes, we thought that was the story, and we were correct, and these are the results that we expect to have. Or we thought this was the story, and we did research, and oops, we were completely wrong, but we didn't spend millions of dollars wasting our money on something that we shouldn't have built. So, yes. Again, long answer to.
Thank you.
All right. Again, thank you. This was really fun. I'll be hanging around for a little bit. And out of curiosity, I'm wondering how many of you are going to be in the workshop tomorrow? So, okay, perfect. That is very helpful. So for you, I will see you there. And for the rest of you, again, on my website, you can find find the book and download all this other stuff. And stay in touch. I love to see how you're working on this stuff on your own projects. So again, thank you.